On this quiet riverbank in central Minnesota, a farm boy used to lie in the grass and watch the sky. He slept on an open porch through the winter, swam in the Mississippi below the bluff, and one day climbed onto the roof of his house to see his first airplane. 25 years later, that same boy flew alone from New York to Paris and became, overnight, the most famous man on Earth. Today, we are walking the farm where Charles Lindbergh grew up. It is a state park now, and every trail here leads back to the river that raised him. We are at Charles A. Lindbergh State Park, on the southwest edge of Little Falls in Morrison County, Minnesota. Little Falls sits almost at the geographic center of the county, straddling the Mississippi River about 33 miles north of St. Cloud. The park covers 569 acres today, wrapped around Pike Creek where it winds down to meet the Great River. It is named not for the famous aviator, but for his father, a congressman who once farmed this very ground. The whole story of this place, the farm, the family, and the flight, unfolds along the path we are about to walk. The trail eases away from the trailhead and into shaded woods almost immediately. This is an easy, gentle walk, with soft footing and only about 90 feet of climb across the whole loop. Popular routes here run between about 2 and 3 miles, looping through forest, along the creek, and out toward the river. Notice how quickly the trees close overhead and the sound of the road disappears. For the next hour, the park asks nothing of you but attention. The ground under our boots is glacial till, dropped here by ice sheets between 100,000 and 10,000 years ago. When the glaciers pushed down from the north, they carried stone with them, and they left some of it behind in spectacular fashion. Look into the bed of Pike Creek, and you can see boulders of slate that the ice hauled in from country far to the north. The creek has been washing over them ever since, a small stream sorting the luggage of a vanished glacier. It is a reminder that everything here, even the river bluffs, is young by the clock of stone. Here the trail falls in beside Pike Creek, the little waterway that gives this corner of the county its shape. The creek drops through the park on its way to the Mississippi, sliding over those glacier-borne boulders in a chain of small riffles. In summer, the banks are thick and green, and the water runs tea-colored over the dark stone. This was the sound of the Lindbergh farm, the background music of a boyhood. Stay with the creek, because almost everything in this park was built along it. The forest around us is unusually honest, because it still looks much the way it did before settlement. This stretch of the Mississippi Valley grew pine forest mixed with oak, broken here and there by openings of prairie grass. That mixture survives in the park today, tall pines on the terraces, sturdy oaks on the drier ground, and light-filled gaps between them. Farther north, the pines thickened into the great timber country that built Minnesota. And that timber, as we will see, is exactly what built the town next door. Little Falls takes its name from a real place, a set of low falls on the Mississippi where the river stumbled over rock. Falls mean power, and power meant mills, so dams went across the river here early, driving sawmills through the 1800s. The dam standing today is a hydroelectric station, still pulling work out of the same drop in the same river. Towns on the upper Mississippi tended to grow wherever the water could be made to labor. Little Falls grew fast, and for a while it grew rich. The trail climbs gently onto a terrace with the Mississippi somewhere off through the trees. It is worth pausing on that word, terrace, because the river cut these level benches as it settled into its valley. The Lindbergh house itself stands on a bluff like this, looking down at the water. One thing has changed since the family lived here. Damming has raised the level of the Mississippi well above the river the young Lindbergh swam in, so the wild, rocky stream of his boyhood now wears a calmer face. In the 1890s, two lumber barons, Charles Wpa and Richard Musser, set up the Pine Tree Lumber Company in Little Falls. They bought a huge tract of forested railroad land, took over an old mill on the east bank, and built a new mill on the west side of the river. The town boomed, and its population doubled within a decade as workers poured in for mill jobs. But pine is capital that does not grow back on a payroll schedule. By 1920, the surrounding timber was exhausted, the mill closed, and the lumber era in Little Falls was over in barely 30 years. Everything we are walking through now was once a working farm, and a well-loved one. Its owner was a Little Falls lawyer named Charles August Lindbergh. Known around town simply as CA, he bought this land along the river for a dairy farm at the close of the 1890s, when the sawmills downstream were still screaming through pine logs. Cattle, goats, hogs, sheep, and chickens once grazed and scratched where these trees now stand. The forest you see is what patience does with a pasture. C.A. Lindbergh had come a long way to own riverfront in Minnesota. He was born in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1859 and carried to America as an infant when his family emigrated and took the name Lindbergh. He grew up to become a prominent lawyer and real estate man in Little Falls, respected, serious, and stubbornly independent. In March of 1901, he married Evangeline Lodge Land, a college-educated teacher from a family of Detroit physicians who had come to town the autumn before. The couple built a fine 3-story house on the bluff above the Mississippi, and in 1902, their only child together was born, a boy named Charles. On the 5th of August, 1905, a fire broke out on the 3rd floor of that new house, and no one ever learned why. The family and their household staff all escaped, and they even managed to carry many of their belongings out onto the lawn, but the house burned down to its stone foundation. The Lindberghs rebuilt on the same foundation, though the new house was much smaller, and it fit so awkwardly on the old footprint that one short hallway ended up with 7 doors leading off it. That modest gray house, finished in 1906, is the one still standing in the park today. It would become one of the most famous boyhood homes in America. Give this stretch of trail a moment of quiet, because the story is about to leave the farm for a while. In 1907, the year after the new house was finished, C.A. Lindbergh was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He would serve 5 consecutive terms, a full decade in Washington. For his young son, that changed everything about what home meant. The farm on the Mississippi became the place the boy was always leaving and always aching to get back to. Through his father's years in Congress, young Charles spent most of each year shuttling between Washington and his grandparents in Detroit. He often lived only 2 or 3 months a year at the house above the river, yet those months were the ones that counted. He later credited his time working and playing on this farm and along this river for his strength and his self-reliance. Cities taught him arithmetic, but the riverbank taught him nerve. Somewhere off this trail, the boy Charles had the run of a private kingdom. The upper floor of the rebuilt house was never finished, and it became his exclusive play area, a whole story of bare boards and possibility. Below it ran the creek and the river, his laboratory for rafts, swimming, and ice. The farm gave him animals to tend, machines to fix, and distances to cover on foot. It is not hard, walking here, to see how a boy could come out of these woods believing he could handle things alone. The most telling room in the Lindbergh house is barely a room at all. The boy's bedroom was really a screened-in porch, open to the weather, and he slept out there on all but the very coldest nights of the Minnesota winter. Think about what that means in a place where winter goes far below zero. He liked the cold air, the night sounds, and the feeling of sleeping halfway outdoors. Years later, alone in a freezing cockpit over the North Atlantic, that porch may have been the best training he ever had. One day in 1911, the boy heard an engine louder than anything the farm had ever produced. He scrambled out a window of his unfinished upper floor and onto the roof of the house to find it. There, above the river valley, he saw his first airplane, a frail contraption of wood and wire droning across the Minnesota sky. He was 9 years old. No one on this farm could have guessed what that one glance would eventually cost and give the world. The trail works back toward Pike Creek here, and it is a good place to let the timeline breathe. Out in the wider world, these were the years when aviation grew from a stunt into a science. On this farm, they were simply years of chores, school terms away, and summers on the water. The house on the bluff held a family that was quietly coming apart, and the boy in the middle of it kept turning his attention to machines. Machines, unlike almost everything else in his life, did what they promised. In 1917, Charles and his mother moved back into the house year-round, and the teenager took over the running of the farm himself. He turned out to be a natural, and he became an early adopter of farm mechanization, bringing machinery onto the place at a time when most neighbors still worked entirely by muscle. He raised stock, drove machines, and ran the operation while still a schoolboy. The farm was his first command. Flying would be his second. Walk this straightaway and picture the farm in its last working years. The boy who ran it left in 1920 to attend college, and the fields began their long surrender to the trees around you. He came back only once in 1923, and he did it in style, landing his own surplus Curtiss Jenny biplane in a field on the west side of the property. The war had flooded America with cheap trainer aircraft, and young Lindbergh had bought one and taught himself the barnstorming trade. The runway he used is somewhere under this forest. That Jenny landing in 1923 was the last bright day of the Lindbergh farm. Within 2 years, the barn burned down, and in May of 1924, C.A. Lindbergh died, after a decade in Congress and a lifetime of hard independence. The farm was left largely neglected, the house standing empty above the river. The family scattered, and the son threw himself completely into aviation, flying the mail between St. Louis and Chicago. The empty house on the bluff waited, though nobody yet knew what it was waiting for. As the trail bends toward the Mississippi, the story leaves Minnesota entirely. In 1926, a New York hotel man named Raymond Ordeg was still offering a $25,000 prize for the first nonstop flight between New York and Paris. Crews of famous aviators were preparing huge multi-engine aircraft, and several men had already died trying. Into this contest stepped a 25-year-old airmail pilot from the Midwest whom the newspapers barely knew. His plan was considered somewhere between bold and suicidal. One engine, one wing, one man. In the early morning of Friday, May 20th, 1927, Charles Lindbergh sat at the end of a muddy runway on Roosevelt Field, Long Island. His silver monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, was so heavy with fuel that men had doubted it would leave the ground at all. At 7:52, he opened the throttle, staggered into the air, and cleared the wires at the far end by mere feet. Ahead lay water weather, and a distance no one had ever flown alone. He carried some sandwiches, a couple of canteens of water, and no radio. For 33.5 hours, Lindbergh flew on, through fog banks, storm clouds, and a night over the open Atlantic that nearly finished him. He fought sleep hour after hour, flying at times within feet of the waves to stay awake, navigating by compass and dead reckoning alone. The journey covered about 3,600 miles, from Long Island past Newfoundland, over the ocean to Ireland, England, and finally France. The farm boy who had slept on a freezing porch now held himself awake over a freezing sea. Every skill this Riverbank had taught him was in that cockpit. At 22 minutes past 10 on the night of May 21st, the Spirit of St. Louis touched down at Le Bourget airfield outside Paris. A crowd estimated at 150,000 people stormed the field and pulled him from the cockpit in a delirium of celebration. The prize was $25,000, but the prize hardly mattered anymore. Back in New York, some 4 million people turned out for his ticker tape parade. The boy from the bluff above the Mississippi was suddenly the most celebrated human being alive, and Little Falls would even name a riverside park Le Bourget in honor of that landing field. And here is the strange hinge of this whole place. Fame that size reached all the way back to this quiet riverbank, and it was not gentle. Souvenir hunters began breaking into the empty Lindbergh house, prying off pieces, carrying away whatever could be lifted. The home of America's hero was being loved to death in his absence. The people of Little Falls watched it happen and decided the house, and the farm around it, needed protecting. Encouraged by those locals, the Lindbergh family donated the 110-acre farm to the state of Minnesota in 1931 as a park in memory of the father, C.A. Lindbergh, not the famous son. A Little Falls state senator, Christian Rosenmeyer, authored the legislation that established the park. The family worked with the Minnesota Historical Society to restore the home and returned many of its original furnishings. They asked one thing, that the park stay quiet, without intensive development for swimming or crowds. That request still shapes the gentle, wooded park we are hiking today. Watch for worked stone as the trail loops back toward the picnic grounds, because the next chapter was built by hand. In the late 1930s, this park became a Depression-era work site. Crews of relief workers cut local stone and timber and shaped this landscape with tools and wheelbarrows. What they built is still here and still in use, nearly 90 years later. Very few public works age that gracefully. Between 1938 and 1939, the Works Progress Administration built the park's picnic shelter, a latrine, a water tower, a stone retaining wall along Pike Creek, and even a pair of drinking fountains. They worked in the rustic style favored by the National Park Service, using local stone and logs so the buildings seemed to grow out of the ground. The structures have barely changed since, and in 1989 they were listed together on the National Register of Historic Places as a 9-acre historic district. The same picnic shelter design was used again at Lake Bemidji State Park. Run a hand over that stonework and you are touching the New Deal itself. The house on the bluff had one more scene to play. In 1969, it passed to the Minnesota Historical Society, which still operates it with a museum as the Charles Lindbergh House, a National Historic Landmark. In 1973, at the grand opening of the Visitor Center, an elderly Charles Lindbergh stood on the porch of his boyhood home and gave what became his final public address. He died the following year. The man who had circled the world ended his public life on the same porch where the boy had slept in the winter air. Today, the park protects 569 acres of that old farm country, with quiet loops like this one running 2 to 3 miles through the pines. There is a small campground with 38 sites, a group camp, and even a canoe in sight down on the Mississippi, all kept deliberately modest, just as the family asked. Next door, the Lindbergh House and Museum tell the family story room by room, and the County Historical Society's Wpa Museum stands just above the mouth of Pike Creek. You can walk the whole arc of this place in an afternoon, glacier, forest, farm, and flight. Not bad for a quiet riverbank in Morrison County. So that is Charles A. Lindbergh State Park, a father remembered, a boyhood preserved, and a river that taught a boy to trust himself all the way across an ocean. If your travels ever bring you up the Mississippi through central Minnesota, give this park an unhurried afternoon and stand a moment on the bluff above the water. Some places make history loudly, but this one just raised a boy who did. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.